Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
So you recently got back from Taos, New Mexico. What were you up to down there, Chris?
I was invited to visit my friend Phil Poirier. He runs Bonnie Doon Engineering. If you're in the jewelry industry at all, and you check out, let's say, the Rio Grande catalog or their website, you'll see all the Bonnie Doon products that are out there, and they're primarily for hydraulic forming, so hydraulic presses and the tooling and add-ons for using a hydraulic press. Phil and I met a few years ago at the Ornamental Turners International at one of their symposiums, and he and I were both speaking at the Santa Fe Symposium earlier this year. So we've become good friends over that the last couple of years. He invited me down to visit and stay with him and his wife for a few days, hang out in the shop and play around with some of the tools that he has that I don't have access to, and also shoot some video. If you go on to Phil's Instagram feed, you can see a short video that we recorded of me doing some engine turning on a pen cap, as well as I ended up doing some engine turning on a few other things, although I'm not sure if they made it into that video. He's giving a talk next year at the Santa Fe Symposium on engine turning. This is a continuation of a series of talks he's been giving on engine turning at the symposium. So this is the next one, and I believe this one is focused on straight line engine work, which is something that I'm very familiar with and have done a lot of. So it was nice to spend a few days down there and see what he's doing. It's always nice to see how other people work in their shop, and also just to be able to sit down in a relaxed environment to talk about the things that you're doing. He obviously knows a lot more about deep drawing and hydraulic forming than I do. He's been doing it for 30 years or something like that. And I'm still a relative newbie at doing deep drawing. So it was nice to be able to bounce ideas off of him and get some ideas on how to fix problems that I've been having with my processes. So that was rather nice.
Nice. So what sort of tools does Phil have that you don't normally have access to, or what did you play with while you were down there?
Oh, well, he has an impressive collection of engine turning and ornamental turning engines. So he has a 14-inch plant straight line engine like the one that I have. He also has a plant rose engine. He has a ornamental lathe built by Fred Armbruster. That's very nice, as well as a lean hard rose engine that is absolutely gorgeous. I would kill to have one of those rose engines in my shop. They're absolutely stunning. And he's got a few others, some of the smaller ones like the Field Rose engine, which is what I have. So being able to play with some of his engine turning equipment and his ornamental turning engines was very nice. And also seeing some of the add-ons that he has for it and the setups and stuff. So that was nice. On the manufacturing side of things, they have a few nice machines, a couple of nice CNC lathes, and a nice CNC vertical machining center that are nice to be able to work in and make tooling and stuff from. So I had a chance to hang out with him and his assistant Brooke, who does the work in the shop as well. So the two of them were great. They were very welcoming, and we had a really good couple of days doing that. This was my first time visiting Taos, New Mexico, and it's I guess around 2.5 hours north of Albuquerque, and it's very close to the New Mexico-Colorado border. It's up in the mountains. It's a ski resort town in the winter. So in this case, I flew into Denver and rented a car and drove down. I guess it's around 4 hours down to Taos. Unfortunately, flying into Albuquerque from Ottawa is difficult. There aren't a lot of great flights that go in there, so it was faster for me to fly to Denver and then drive down. One thing I didn't realize about Taos is just how many incredible artists there are in the area and living there. It's a relatively small town. I want to say it's a few 100,000 people, maybe 250,000 people, 300,000 people. But there's some incredible artists there. And of course, Phil, having lived there for a long time, he's good friends with a number of these people. We went around and did a few shop visits while I was there. Peter Gilroy is a jeweler down there. He does some impressive work and has worked with Phil before in the past. They spoke last year together. Their talk on die forming in a hydraulic press, and Peter does some great work in jewelry that's inspired by his love of rock climbing. And there's some gorgeous rock climbing in that area. If you're ever interested in rock climbing, go down to Taos. There's some stunning scenery and incredible places to climb. So we had a chance to spend a morning with Peter and see some of the stuff that he's working on. So that was fun. I've been a fan of his work for a long time, so it was nice to be able to see his shop and chat with him about what he's doing. We also had a chance to visit Michael Walker. If you're in the knife world, or if you've been interested in the knife world, then Mike Walker's name is one that you'll recognize. He has been at the top of, I guess, the collectible knife market for 35 years at this point. And he's a remarkable maker. He has invented a number of incredible mechanisms for knives, everything from how to lock knife blades open, as well as some impressive techniques for making dual metal blades that are mechanically connected together in sort of a dovetail fashion. Mike has done some amazing work over the years. It was a true pleasure to be able to chat with him for a few hours and see what he's doing in his shop, and be able to talk to him about some of the techniques that he's worked on, and some of the unique things that he's created and how he's created them. So yeah, that was nice. Julie Lake, who's another jeweler in the area, she stopped by while we were at Mike's shop actually, and chatted with her for a few minutes. And she's doing some fun things with stainless steel and welding and creating jewelry that has a volume to it. A lot of it's sort of open cage work type jewelry, and a lot of it's beautiful. Her welding work is amazing. Out of the blue, one night, Phil said, "Hey, do you want to go flying tomorrow morning?" And I said, "Flying? Yeah, sure. I'm always up for going flying. I've loved flying since I was a kid. Absolutely. I was more than happy to go flying." And it turns out that a friend of his in town, Chris Bredin. Sorry, Chris, I'm mangling your name. He is an incredible photographer, landscape photographer, and he shoots from his ultralight. He took me up on Friday morning. We got up to fly around Taos for about 45 minutes. He has a great gimbal set up in front of his ultralight, so he can set up his still camera or his video camera to be able to do amazing photography. Of course, the beauty of being in an ultralight is that you don't have any plane around you, really. So you have a great view of the world, such an incredible way of seeing the landscape and what's going on around you. And for any of you who are motorcyclists, this is sort of the equivalent of being a motorcyclist in the air. You know, you get that feeling of being there. With a motorcycle, if you're riding around a country in a motorcycle, you really get a sense of temperature changes and smells and, changes in humidity and everything like that, because you're out there in the elements. And this is the same kind of thing. It's very different than being even in a small plane like a Cessna, because you are out there in the sky and there's nothing around you, just a small bit of plane. That was a lot of fun. And we'll have a link to Chris's Instagram feed in the show notes, and I suggest everybody check out his Instagram feed. It is absolutely stunning, the shots that he gets. Yeah, that was a lot of fun. That was the most fun I've had in a long time, and just totally out of the blue and random. Like, it was entirely unplanned on my part. And of course I'm sitting there thinking afterwards, like, how do I get myself one of these ultralights? Because it would be so much fun to fly one of those.
No, and the landscape there looks incredible. Similar to, I'd say, the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, there's some gorgeous landscape there. You're up in the mountains, so Taos is around, I think it's around 7,500 feet, maybe 7,000 feet. It's so you're up in the mountains, but it's a gorgeous plain. It used to be part of a huge volcano range, if I understand correctly from what Chris was saying. And so that whole area was basically covered in in very rich earth after this volcanic eruption about 1 million years ago. So there's a beautiful lush scenery that's around there. There's a lot more agriculture there and beautiful vegetation that's there, more than I would have expected. When you think about New Mexico, you think about a desert. But this is gorgeous area. Plus, it has, you're up in the mountains, so there's stunning views from that. There's a gorge that we flew through the Rio Grande Gorge, and we were able to sort of see some of that. And overall, it was great. So definitely check out Chris's feed, see what kind of scenery is out there. But yeah, it was a true pleasure to be able to do that. It was entirely unexpected and a lot of fun.
Having been exposed to some new tools and add-ons for engine turning, are there any items you want to replicate for yourself in your own shop?
Yeah, there are. There's a few things that I want to build. Some of them are things that just aren't practical for me to build, or I don't really need. They'd be fun to have, but I don't really need. Like this ornamental lathe that Phil has, his Armbruster ornamental lathe, it's an impressive machine. It's a beautiful engine. Like it is absolutely gorgeous, but it's not really that useful for the kind of work that I do. Having spoken with Phil and bounced around some ideas, I've been thinking about building my own straight line engine, and I think that I may end up doing that. There are a few things that bother me about the antique engines that are out there, and they weren't really designed for doing work at the detail level that watchwork, for instance, demands. There are a few things that I'd like to build into my own engine. Certainly some modern conveniences, things like putting a digital readout, DRO, onto the engine so that I can easily find where I am and be able to see digitally what's going on with the offsets on the machine and things like that. So there's I think at some point I'm gonna have to build my own straight line engine. And of course, being Bonnie Doon, being the guys who create a lot of this great stuff for doing hydraulic forming, I'm definitely going to be looking at getting into a better hydraulic press than the one that I've got, as well as some new tooling that I don't currently have. So that's high on my list of things to do is get into some better hydraulic tooling than what I'm currently using.
So did Phil help you out with the process you currently or been working on for deep drying your pens, or do you just experiment with different things while you're there?
No, we certainly talked about the problems I've been having. For people who aren't familiar with what's going on, the caps for my new line of pens is a deep drawn cap. And the way you do that is you start with a disc of silver in this case. So it's around 2.5 inches in diameter. Using a series of punches and dies, you force the sheet through a die, and it turns it into a cup. And then you use successively smaller dies to force it into a long cylinder. And at some point in my case, I then form it into a shaped curve, because it's not a straight cylinder that I'm using for the cap. It has a bit of a curve to it. And I was having some difficulties with the metal buckling in weird ways that I didn't want, and just unreliability in general. And so Phil was able to help me work through some of the problems. And it turns out that one of my biggest issues is the thickness of silver that I'm using was too thin. There are a lot of interesting interactions that are going on with the metal. The metal is compressing in some places and expanding in other places and stretching. And that interaction of metals, the interaction of how the metal is doing that, tends to cause weird things to happen when you've got really thin metal. So I'm going to go back and use some thicker material for the caps, and that should solve a lot of the problems that I was having. The end of the trip, I drove back up through Colorado Springs and into Denver, and I had a few hours to kill on my way home. And fortunately, a good friend of mine, Rich Littlestone, is in Denver. And I think I've spoken about Rich before on the show. He's another pen maker. He does guilloche work as well. And we've known each other for years through the various shows that we've done, as well as through the OTI. And even though I've been through Denver a number of times since I've known him, our schedules never seem to work out and match up. So fortunately, this time I had a chance to visit his house and his shop and see the things that he's working on. So he does some fascinating work. If you haven't seen Rich's work, go and check it out. It was nice to be able to see his stuff in person and in terms of his workshop and what he's doing. And he's doing some great stuff with die-sync EDM to be able to cut intricate shapes and pockets into the sides of his pens and then inlay mother of pearl into that. It was nice to be able to spend a few hours with Rich and be able to catch up and see what he's doing in the shop. And again, he's got some great engine turning equipment, some great ornamental turning equipment. He just had 2 new Goodell brocading engines delivered to his shop, and so he was slowly starting to go through those. And while he didn't have them up and running yet, they were great machines to look at. So,
does he do the die-sync EDM right there in the shop?
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he has his Synchro EDM right there in the shop, and he does that. And I should mention that's something else that Mike Walker does a lot of. He does a lot of work with wire EDM and die-sync EDM. I'm insanely jealous of these guys having access to EDM technology in their shop, because there's so many things that I would love to do with both wire EDM and die-sync EDM. So they're fascinating technologies that you can do some really cool things with it. You just can't do any other way. Yeah, it would be great to play around with that stuff and be able to experiment with it. But
have you messed around with the EDM equipment at the university nearby?
I've had a few things cut on EDM. My good friend Paul Burberry, he's assisted me a few times with EDM stuff. I need to bribe him into doing some more EDM work for me, because it's, again, doing, especially when you're cutting things like pattern bars for a straight line engine. Really, the only way to do it these days is on wire EDM, and the finish that you get out of it is great. The accuracy that you get out of it is just stunning. And so, yeah, there's some amazing things that you can do with EDM work. That's something I would love to experiment more with. But it's one of those things that it certainly is, especially with the type of stuff that I do, where it's very non-conventional work. It would be nice to actually have access to one of these machines to be able to use on a regular basis, so that I could experiment and see what works and what doesn't work. That's one of the comments Mike made when I was chatting with him, is he had a couple of job shops in the area who were doing his EDM work for him, his wire EDM work in particular, and they just weren't able to hold the tolerances that he wanted, and the back and forth and everything. It was taking a long time to prototype stuff, so he ended up getting his own wire EDM machine and was able to start doing that work himself. It's nice to be able to do things on your own. As I've sort of mentioned through some of the previous episodes, I do a lot of my own casting. I do my own engraving. And one of the advantages of having these tools available and being able to do this stuff in your own shop is that you can work at your own pace. You can prototype quickly. You can fail quickly. And that's probably one of the most important things. John Saunders of NYC CNC, and he talks about failing quickly when he's doing something. And by that, he means try something, and if it doesn't work, don't spend a huge amount of time on it, but keep working on it, then work on the next thing, the next way of doing it. And if you can prototype this stuff in your own shop and do this work yourself, then you can very quickly iterate and find what does work. So in my case, because I have access to CNC mill for cutting waxes, or a 3D printer for printing waxes, as well as all my own casting stuff, I can come up with an idea at 11 o'clock at night on a Friday, model it in Rhino, print it out overnight or mill it out overnight, and by the end of Saturday, I have a cast piece in my hand, and I can then see it in the flesh and be able to work on it from there. There are huge advantages to having access to these tools yourself and in your own space.
Yeah, I prefer to think of it more as getting over your failures quickly, moving on to your successes.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. And the faster you can fail, the faster you can work on the next version of it and be able to get something that does work. And so again, with deep drawing, I could send out deep drawing work to other people, but this allows me to make design changes and and that kind of thing quickly as well. So that's why I want to do it myself.
While you were preparing to head out from Taos back to Denver, I took receipt of the iPhone 10. I know you've received yours now as well. What do you think of it?
Yeah, you teased me with your iPhone 10 and sent me some Animoji while I was there. I know we originally both had the same delivery date, but you got yours a week ahead of time, or a week ahead of me, I should say. Yeah, so far, I guess I've had this for 2 weeks now, and I'm a huge fan of this phone. I had an iPhone 7 Plus before. I have to say up front, Face ID is amazing, and I love it. I spend a lot of time in the shop wearing nitrile gloves to protect my hands, and so Touch ID was a thing that either it couldn't work at all because I had nitrile gloves on, or the other problem is that my hands are so chewed up from being in the shop and working in the shop that oftentimes my fingerprints just wouldn't register properly with Touch ID. Face ID is far more reliable for me. It's much faster, and that alone for me is worth the price of admission. What about you? How do you feel about the phone now that you've had it for a couple of weeks?
Definitely agree with you with Face ID. Well, I guess let's get the obvious thing out of the way. The design is top notch. But yeah, I'm a big fan of Face ID. It has fallen on its face a few times for me, but I mean, Touch ID didn't work 100% of the time either.
The accuracy of Face ID is something that a lot of people have been talking about, and this was the same thing that everybody talked about when Touch ID came out, was how accurate is it and how good is it. And honestly, this is much better than the first version of Touch ID, and I think for me in particular, it's much better than the second generation of Touch ID as well. And so while it does fail, for me, it's far more consistent and than Touch ID was.
Yeah, and the wireless charging's been awesome too. It's really convenient to just be able to drop it on its pad at the end of the day and at work. Just being able to, I have another little pad that I ordered and keep in my bench, and just drop it on there if it needs a boost. Battery life's been phenomenal. It hasn't really needed a boost, except one day where I had misplaced it on the charger at night, and I was down at 60% starting my day. I mean, I could probably go for 2 days without running out of battery.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. The battery life on it has been incredible. I've come from a 7 Plus that was only a year old, so my battery was still in good condition, and it was a large battery, so I could easily get a day and a half, 2 days of battery out of my 7 Plus. And I was a little concerned going down to a smaller sized phone with a smaller sized battery if I was going to be able to do the same thing. And I can definitely get 2 days out of this. And in my case, I'm happy because the center console on my car has a Qi wireless charger in it. And so now, a year after getting this car, I can finally use the wireless charger that's in it. So it's nice when I'm driving, into the city or whatever. I can get. It's not fast, and it's not going to completely fill my phone, but I can at least get sort of 5 to 10% on my phone when I'm in the car and driving into town.
Now, do you have wireless CarPlay as well?
I do. I've had CarPlay wireless CarPlay in the car from day one. The 7 Plus was able to do that as well. So the advantage of being able to just throw it in the center console, start charging it, it just starts playing whatever the last thing was that I was playing on my phone. So whether it's a podcast or an audiobook or whatever it was, I don't have to do anything. I just basically start driving and away I go, and I don't have to plug my phone in at all, which is so liberating.
So what Qi chargers are you using around the house?
I have the Anchor one. I don't remember exactly which model it is. We'll put it in the show notes, but I've been very happy with this Anchor one. It was relatively inexpensive. One of the nice things about this Anchor charger is it has some blue LEDs on it, which sort of glow a couple of times when it starts charging, and then they shut off. So you don't have to worry about there being an LED on while it's charging all the time, but it gives you that visual indication that you've actually started charging the phone. Overall, I've been impressed with that. The speed of the wireless charging doesn't bother me because, as you say, we're charging it at night or during the day or whatever, so it's not too big a deal. Now, what are your thoughts so far on the screen on this, like the visually on the screen? We'll talk about the development side of it in a bit, but what do you think so far of the screen?
Visuals of the OLED display are fantastic. Really impressed with the color accuracy and just how crystal clear everything looks on the display. It really is like just painted up on the glass. As far as the size of the screen itself, I mean, I'm coming from the opposite side of the spectrum as you. I've owned a number of the larger devices for development purposes, but for my personal everyday carry, I've stuck with the 5S form factor. No, just 'cause that's my favorite of all the iPhone designs to date. So that's been my everyday carry for a good number of years. So it's been quite the shift to go to a bigger screen that is essentially having the plus size screen in a normal size phone. So it's been a stretch, to say the least. I've turned on the one-handed keyboard just because I find that a lot more convenient, because I'm often using the keyboard one-handed, so that nudges all the keys over to one side of the screen. And that can be accessed just by long pressing on the internationalization keyboard shortcut there at the bottom of the screen. Reaching up at the top of the screen's been a challenge, so I've got reachability turned on as well. And then I've got a few odd gestures where I will wrap my fingers around the edge of the other side of the screen to try and tap on touch targets. So for me, it's a touch too big. I would love the edge-to-edge screen in a slightly smaller device. And actually, I was gathering up some old iOS devices to prep to sell the other day, and I picked up an iPod Touch. And that, to me, just the feel of it in the hand actually feels more futuristic than the iPhone 10 to me. And that's a product that's got to be 4 or 5 years old as far as the first gen of that iPod Touch goes. It's just so slim and small. So if that had an edge-to-edge screen, and I had the choice between a device of that size and a device the size of the iPhone 10, no question, I would go for the smaller device size. Screen real estate's nice for reading things, but I tend to actually use VoiceOver quite a bit. I use the audio side of the device significantly more, just because my hands are often occupied doing other things.
I'll have to experiment with that a little bit. I've never used the VoiceOver stuff, really. I know you showed me once or twice the setting it up and using it, but I've never really used the VoiceOver, and it sounds like something that might be worth experimenting with.
Yeah, and I had a wireless earbud long before AirPods came out, and the earbuds I use are dirt cheap, like $3.75 for the last one that I picked up, and that was including shipping. So it's like little chiclets. I could, if I happen to drop one or lose one, it doesn't really matter. I haven't lost one to date, but I've just got a handful of earbuds. So I've been using those for years, and it's fantastic. I don't even have to pull my phone out of my pocket to spin up where I last left off on a podcast or listening to music. I just pull an earbud out of my pocket, turn it on, it pairs automatically, press it again, and it starts resuming play from where I last left off. But the HDR on the screen is amazing. Watching the few videos that I watched, my wife and I have been watching Planet Earth 2 recently, and I've watched a few clips just myself on the phone, just going back and looking at things there, and it's just been, it's a gorgeous screen.
Yeah, it's funny because I guess I haven't noticed as much of a jump in screen technology as you did, because I'm coming from a 7 Plus where things like the screen is much closer to the glass on a 7 Plus than it was in the 5S. So the things like that, sort of that painted look, I experienced that several generations ago. So that wasn't really as big a jump for me.
I find the clarity on the pixels better than the Plus devices that I have. That's just to my eye.
Yeah, the dot size is a little bit better, and it's a bit of a finer dot size, and then the native resolution, it doesn't do this weird scaling thing that the 7 Plus does. So you're right, from that point of view, it is slightly better. The reachability isn't a problem for me. I can comfortably reach the top right corner to get to control center. I can comfortably reach across the screen and type one-handed if I need to. But I tend to type with 2 thumbs a lot, and I find the keyboard is just a little bit too small for me. I find the touch targets are just a little bit too small, even though it is a bit wider. It is not quite as wide as the Plus phone is, and so I find that little bit of compression is a bit awkward, but it's not as small, or it isn't as narrow as the sort of the standard 7 or 8 or whatever. So it's a bit easier to type on than a 7, a normal size 7 would have been, but it's still just a little bit smaller than I'm comfortable with. So the screen size, it's funny because I'm looking forward to next year when they're the rumors are they're going to bring out a plus size version of this phone, and I will probably get that just because I do like having the extra real estate when I'm typing. I dislike the physical size of it and how much space it takes up in my pocket. I'm the first to admit that. It's miserable to have in your pocket. But I find that having that extra real estate when I'm typing is really nice.
Yeah, the pocketability has been an adjustment for me as well. I definitely notice it in my pocket. So this is the opposite side of the spectrum from you. I notice it more in my pocket now, whereas you probably notice it much less. Or you weren't even carrying your plus in your front pockets, where you throw it in your back pocket.
That's just it. I was carrying my plus in my back pocket most of the time because putting it in my front pocket, I couldn't sit down with it in my front pocket. It was just too large. And so I would put it in my back pocket, and then when I would sit down, I would take it out. Whereas with this, I can put it in my front pocket and sit down, and it's a little bit awkward, but it's doable. Whereas with the plus, you just can't do that. You know, what I may do is start experimenting more with using dictation for typing and see if that helps with, in certain circumstances when I'm typing instead of using the keyboard. And I know some people who've done that, because if I can avoid the extra physical size of the plus and the associated increase in cost as well, then that would be good.
I guess it's a lot easier for you to do dictation because you're primarily by yourself around the shop, so it's not as awkward.
Yeah, it doesn't look as weird when I'm standing there talking to myself as it does when you are, if you've got other people around in the shop with you. So that helps a lot. But of course and I'm used to it now with having AirPlay in the car. I do dictate message replies and whatnot in the car. So that helps. I've gotten used to that back and forth. It's a bit awkward at first, but I've gotten used to that back and forth with Siri and dictating. So the dictation is pretty good. I've been happy with the results of it so far. So it may be worthwhile doing that more in the shop. Now, the one thing I will say about the screen that I have noticed, and anyone who hasn't sort of played around with an iPhone 10 yet, you might not realize this, but anything that has a dark theme that is not a black background looks so outdated at this point. Anything that isn't pure black, it jumps out at you. So, for instance, with something like Tweetbot, where they had a dark background or a dark mode that wasn't black, it was, you'd look at this thing and it would just look horrible on the iPhone 10. And since then, Tweetbot, they've released a version that has the normal day, sort of light mode, a dark mode, and then a black mode. So if you're on an iPhone 10, you can put it into black mode, and that makes a big difference. So if you're an iOS developer and you've got a dark theme on your iOS app, you need to put a black background version on there, because those dark mode versions just look horrible on the iPhone 10.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say horrible. It's just they jump out at you more. Whereas when you have a fully blacked out theme, it just melts into the device the way that a slightly gray does not. And there's a stark contrast in that.
Yeah, and that's why I say that I think it looks horrible, because it does have that gray that jumps out at you, and it just, all of a sudden you're very conscious of the fact that this is a screen that has edges. And if you've got a black background, the screen doesn't have an edge to it.
Mm-hmm.
It just, you're not displaying anything on that part of the screen as far as you're concerned. So my brain has a difficult time with the dark mode themes that aren't black, and whereas the ones that are black, I find that they definitely work better.
Yeah, the gray themes just sort of land in an uncanny valley of the fusion of hardware and software, whereas black, it's just boom, the two are fused.
That's right. Yeah. Now, this transition is not as bad looking as the transition to Retina was, for instance. Like when that jump to the iPhone 4, when people hadn't updated their apps for Retina screens yet, that was horrible. That was easily the worst of these jumps that's been made. And even the jump up to the plus-sized phones a few years ago, that wasn't great, but it wasn't too horrible. So hopefully people will update their apps. And same thing with dealing with the bar at the top. App developers, of course, need to modify it a little bit for that, but it's not as bad when you see a non-optimized app on an iPhone 10 than let's say with the non-Retina apps.
Yeah, I'd say the transition's more akin to the 4S to 5 transition where things just end up letterbox.
That's right. I noticed that there was a Twix update recently to support the iPhone 10. So how did you find, as a developer, how did you find the changeover and the migration to the iPhone 10?
I would say it's relatively straightforward. The only reason that I didn't get either of them out day one is because I wanted to physically test them on the device first to make sure the usability was good. So I waited until I actually had the device in my hand, and then did actually make a number of tweaks based on actually using them on the device itself rather than just in the simulator. Kella was a far more straightforward update. Twix took a little bit longer. Just some strange edge cases to deal with there in terms of things that I was doing with table views and scroll views and whatnot. But yeah, it was, I would say, a pretty painless transition. There was a couple of things I ended up needing to do in code, but otherwise a lot of it could just be done from the interface builder side of things, just literally by ticking a checkbox and changing a few layout constraints. But yeah, it was I would say a smooth transition. And I've been playing around with, new sensors and camera capabilities and whatnot. It's been fun to be able to do that.
Oh, good. Yeah, some of the new camera sensors that are in the phone, the depth sensors that are there, the new cameras in themselves are far more capable than some of the older phones. So I'm sure there'll be some excellent tools for you to use in your apps.
Yeah, I'd say that the camera is what I like most about the iPhone 10. The camera and the wireless charging. Those would be my top two things that I most enjoy about this particular upgrade.
I tend to use my phone in the shop for doing still photos of the work I'm doing, but also for video work. I decided to play around with some gallium yesterday, and so I had some liquid gallium rolling around in my hand, and I shot that at 4K 60, which is a new frame rate available on the iPhone 10. And unfortunately, the Instagram video is heavily compressed and it doesn't look great. But the original 4K 60 footage on my phone just looks crystal clear. It is absolutely stunning. So I'm really looking forward to experimenting some more with the video that's on there. I'm not sure how much of a difference I'll notice with the still cameras on my phone compared to my 7 Plus. I know there certainly is an improvement with them, and especially in the telephoto lens, there's definitely a big improvement in low light capability and having the optical image stabilization on the telephoto lens as well. So I'm sure I'll notice it there, but I just haven't had a chance to play with it that much. For me at this point, the biggest change has definitely been the Face ID. That I would buy this phone every day of the week just for Face ID. Alone, even if it had no other updates to it, that would be worth it for me.
Yeah, I want it on my laptop.
Absolutely, I want it on everything now. My iPad is probably my primary computer. Outside of my phone. Obviously, my phone is with me all the time, so I'm going in and out of it all the time. But I would love it on my iPad, and I would love it on my MacBook.
Yeah, the interesting thing with the iPad is they'll have to solve the landscape Face ID for sure, because a lot of people use the iPad in either orientation, whereas
sure,
it's more common to hold the iPhone in portrait, and Face ID isn't presently supported in landscape on the iPhone.
You're right. That is going to be something they'll have to deal with, but I don't think they'll have too much of a problem with it. I think that's something they can sort out pretty easily. I am looking forward to it. I was thinking about skipping the next generation of the iPad Pro, but I have a feeling if they bring out Face ID in the next iPad Pro, I may end up buying another iPad.
Yeah, I find the bokeh feature for portrait mode still falls on its face from time to time. But the nice thing about the API side of things on that is that I've noticed Photoshop, I can now mess around with depth maps which I haven't done to too much of a degree. So I can actually go in and fix that in post if there's things like hair that's been taken out. And then on the phone itself, there's a handy app, Focus, that you can go in and play around with the depth maps and modify them there.
I'll have to check out that ability on Photoshop. I didn't realize that you could actually get access to the depth mapping, because that would certainly be handy for fixing some of these problems. And while I agree the portrait mode tends to fall down a little bit, I think for the most part it's been pretty good. And frankly, most of the time I don't find that I need it. They're with the speed of those lenses now, as long as there's some reasonable separation between the subject and their background, you still get some pretty gorgeous bokeh out of it anyways.
In particular, if you use the telephoto lens.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, if you use the telephoto lens, you get you get a great view out of that, and it ends up working out pretty well. So, yeah, overall, the little bit that I've played with the camera, I've been happy with it, and it's certainly been a pleasant improvement.
And I should say the few times that I've used portrait mode, I appreciate the fact that the iPhone renders what you're going to be capturing in real time. Whereas Google's latest Pixel phones, it's all post-processed when they do their bokeh, which is more or less the equivalent. The other thing I should say about the screen is that I've been really impressed by the responsiveness of the interactive animations. So my hats off to Apple's tight integration between the hardware and the firmware and the software teams for pulling that off. It really needs to be tight for them to have eliminated the home button the way that they have.
I know that a few people have talked about their frustration with the actions for using the phone without a home button. And honestly, it took me around 45 seconds to get used to it. It is so natural. I've had no problems with moving back and forth between, applications in the home screen, being able to do the new application switcher, either the carousel or just the swipe to move to a new app. I've had no problems with any of that, and it was so natural for me to do that. I didn't have any issues with it. I'm looking forward to the time when that little white bar at the bottom that's an indicator of where the, sort of the interaction field is, either dims or disappears. I understand that for first generation, they sort of need to put that in there, to sort of indicate what's going on and where people need to go for it. But eventually they'll be able to take that out because everybody will just understand what's going on. And I'm looking forward to that because I do find that a bit distracting sometimes, having that little white bar down there.
I was very tempted to flip the switch to hide it in both my apps because we, as developers, we do have the option to hide it.
Oh, really?
But
interesting.
I figure for starting out, we'll just follow Apple's guidelines and best practices for the time being.
And I will say for people who are, they're change adverse, they don't like things moving around, I will say avoid this phone for a little while. There's certainly people that I know in my life who really dislike it when things get moved, when, whether it's notification center being moved or control center being moved and things like that. And if you really, really are tied to that home button and where your notifications are and your control center is and things like that, I would avoid this phone for a little while because it's, it is a big change from that point of view, I think. And for some people, that's certainly gonna bother them. I think the one thing that I had that's taken me a little while to get used to was control center. I use control center a lot. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the home swipe feature has been so easy for me to get used to. And it's because I was using control center all the time by swiping up from the bottom. But it did take a bit of getting used to okay, no, control center is up in the top right. And I can understand why a lot of people are having a difficult time reaching that. I don't think even though it works for me and I don't have any problems using it, I can understand why a lot of people do, and I don't think that's going to last to iOS 12. Like I think in iOS 12 we're going to see a reimagining of that gesture to something else because I think too many people are having a tough time with it, and it's a challenge for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as responsive as the interactions are, I would say I'm somewhat in alignment with some of what you mentioned earlier there about some people finding some things being longer and more tedious than they need to be. The control center is certainly the more egregious of the bunch for me. And I much prefer the way that it's done on the iPads. When I started running the betas on my iPads back in the summer, I was stoked for this interface of being able to swipe up from the bottom to get into the multitasking switcher.
I can understand that. And I guess it's been, was that in iOS 10? I don't remember if the control panel from the bottom was in iOS 10 or not.
Are you talking about so control center was always there, but being the way that it changed for iOS 11 with the iPads. You would swipe up and you have the control center on the right-hand side, and then your multitasking switcher on the left. And I would like to see them do something similar to this on the iPhone. I don't know if you've seen @_inside on Twitter. He made a little concept video of how this could operate on the iPhone, and that when you do that gesture to swipe up into the carousel to switch between apps, to have it so that if you swipe over, like pull the right side over, so swiping left, you'd have control center right there. I think that'd be a great change for me, because right now there are times where I'll pull down control center using my nose because I just can't get my other hand free, and there's no way I'm going to balance the phone and be able to pull it down.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that video, and but I'll. That sounds like it would be a good thing. As I said, because this is a first generation where a significant change has been made to the interface, I think they have to be a little less subtle. They have to sort of beat you over the head with the idea of, okay, this is in a different place and this is very different than, than that thing is. And so I think it's not very elegant right now, but I think that's a necessity in a first generation change, because it has to be really obvious to people that this thing is different than that thing. So this motion is different than that motion. It's so difficult to know what works well and what doesn't in these circumstances. Whenever you're developing anything like this, you become so close to it, and you become so used to, to doing something. I think it's tough to know what the best ways of doing things. With any design work, there are always compromises, and you have to basically release something like this out into the world to find out if the compromises you decided on are the ones that work best. And I think they got most of it right. There are always going to be little problems with this or things that don't work quite as well. But I think overall, the interface on the 10 and the way that the interactions work, I think for the most part, they got it right. Obviously, there'll be some tweaking, maybe even in iOS 11, who knows? But definitely in iOS 12, I can see there being big changes in the way that the interface works, and improving, sort of refining it a bit. So I'm looking forward to those. I think in the short term, I'm happy with the way that it works, but certainly in the long term, it will improve.
Yeah, I mean, certainly swiping across the bottom to be able to switch back and forth between apps is a huge improvement over double clicking the home button to navigate
absolutely.
between apps. Or, I mean, you could swipe from the very edge of the screen with a force touch to bring that up as well, but very few people knew about that. And
yeah, I always found that force touch swipe over to be really awkward. Even though I could easily reach it, I always found it awkward because that delay of getting the force touch to engage was always frustrating. Whereas the slide over from the bottom is so nice. And I really wish that my iPad could do that, because I'm often swiping around on my iPad.
You don't use the 5-finger swipe?
Yeah, I do use the 4-finger swipe to go back and forth. Right. And that is handy. But there are times where it would be nice to just be able to move over, especially when I've got the pencil in my hand. I find it awkward to be drawing with the pencil and then do the 4-finger swipe over sometimes, just because of the way that I'm holding the pencil. So there are a lot of times when it would be nice to have just a little bar at the bottom like that I could swipe over and be able to get into another app.
Yeah, I find that simple gesture has actually eliminated a large majority of the cases where I would have been engaging the multitasking switcher. Because often I'm just working between 2 or 3 different apps at once, and it doesn't take much to swipe along the bottom to just flip between them. For the most part, the interface is much more fluid and dynamic. It's just the odd case where something's not quite as fluid as I would ideally like it to be, and things that would have taken me 1 swipe before are now taking me 2 swipes, or a swipe and a pause, and that sort of thing. What do you think of the attention awareness of your device?
That's been interesting to get used to. There are parts of it that I absolutely love. Now, if you've got an iPhone 10 and you haven't done this yet, go into Settings, Face ID, and Passcode. There's a bunch of settings at the bottom that say allow access when locked. And I think by default, a lot of those are turned on. And what that means is that when the phone is locked, somebody can pick it up and see things like the recent notifications. They can get access to, Siri and all of that stuff. with the attention aware built into it, you can turn all of those off. And it's nice because you'll see that there's a message sitting there waiting for you, but it doesn't show you the contents of the message until you look at the phone and Face ID engages. And so little features like that are so nice. It means that you can, I can leave my phone. I actually have more things going to my notification screen now than I used to. It used to be that I didn't have a lot going to my notification screen when it was locked, just because I didn't want people being able to randomly see what was on my phone without being able to get it, without a passcode. And now I can have those turned on. I can see that there's an email sitting there, an important email sitting there, or an iMessage. And, I don't have to worry about somebody just randomly looking at it and seeing the contents of a message without a passcode. So that little feature, go in there and turn all that stuff off, and it makes it a little bit more secure, and it's really nice. The Face ID and the attention aware stuff, I've been loving that. It's been a really nice addition. It is a bit weird getting, when you stop looking at your phone for a second and the screen dims quite quickly. That is a bit of an odd thing to get used to.
What really excites me about the fact that devices are attention aware now, down to the point that it knows exactly where your eyes are and where you're looking, is seeing what they do with this down the road with this device, as well as, and more particularly in the future when they introduce newer displays with even more features in them. Did you ever see, I think it was Joshua Topolsky from The Verge, paid a visit to Microsoft's Edison lab a couple years back, probably more than 5 years ago now. And they had an older LCD panel there, but they had a system up on top of the screen that would track your gaze and exactly where your eyes were looking. And using something they called light guide technology, they could choose which eye to direct the screen at any given time. So the backlight could channel the pixels on the screen to just a single line up and down either side of your face. So they could say, if you're doing a 120 hertz refresh rate on the screen, you cut that in half. And then using this light guide technology, you beam different images to each eye. So as you're looking at the screen, what you're perceiving is true three-dimensionality without the need of wearing any sort of 3D glasses or what have you. So I could see them doing a more rudimentary version of this without the light guide technology, just changing 3D objects on the screen based on where you're looking. So if you, say, move your head to the right or the left, or you change your gaze just slightly, the fact that the phone now knows where your pupils are looking, it can change the content of the screen based on that, which will bring a lot more depth to 3D games or 3D interfaces, particularly for AR-based experiences. The AR stuff is phenomenal too, and just how thin the bezels are on this phone makes them even more rich. But I think they're going to be able to take that another step up by knowing exactly where your gaze is set. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with this. I mean, of course, there's a dark side to the fact that the phone knows your attention too. So that, like, I don't want apps like Facebook and things like that being able to know what you're up to. There's, like any technology, upsides and downsides, but I think the bounds of what's possible here are quite exciting.
That sounds really cool, and although for me personally, I think that might be a bit challenging. I find sort of virtual 3D stuff challenging because my eyes don't focus together properly. My left eye is about 15 degrees off. It doesn't quite focus on things properly with my right eye. So I find a lot of that kind of technology tends to give me headaches because it just doesn't match up with what my eyes are really seeing. But I think where that I could see that going and being really useful is sort of the next generation wearable, where we've got, let's say, glasses. If the heads-up display knows where it is that you're looking on the interface, it allows you to interact with that interface by using your eyes better. I know there are technologies out there right now for people with various disabilities, who have a difficult time controlling things with their hands. They can work with just their eyes and even be able to type and things like that with their eyes because the devices know where it is on the screen they're looking. So this, I think, definitely is the sort of the gateway to that technology becoming smaller and better, and something that you could actually build into, let's say, a pair of glasses with a heads-up display and be able to navigate between different screens without needing to use your hands to adjust the interface. So I could see it going down that road, and I would love. I would love to be able to have a heads-up display of what's going on, whether it's directions on where I'm going or information overlays, some sort of AR type thing where it's information overlay about the person that you're meeting. I have a tough time remembering names and occasionally where I've met people in the past. So, it'd be nice to be able to bring up a heads up display saying, oh, hey, this is, so and so that I've, and this is where I last met them or whatever. Same thing with information when you're walking around a foreign city, being able to say, oh, this is that building and this is the, bit of the history. So I could see AR being effective in that kind of context. And if you've got the ability to see where people are looking in that interface, it would mean it's easy to control, or easier to control than trying to do something virtual with your hands, like a Minority Report kind of thing. Like, I think that kind of interface where you're using your hands in these big gestures on a virtual screen, I don't think that's practical. Like, our arms are not really designed for that, and it would be extremely uncomfortable to use it, whereas our eyes are already doing that kind of thing now. And I think that would make it much easier to control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny you should mention interacting with technology using your eyes. Within AR Kit, we now have access to face anchors as of iOS 11. And within that, there's a dictionary of something they call blend shape locations. Using that, I can know whether I can know how wide open your eyes are or not. So rather than having to use a 2-finger pinch gesture to zoom the screen, if you're just squint a bit, it might automatically switch over to the telephoto lens to get you a closer view. Actually, just seeing things respond to my own face on the screen based on what I have told the phone I wanted to do is kind of creepy and empowering all at once. Yeah, it's a whole new realm of exploration.
I could see that being really confusing for people right now.
Yes, exactly.
Because it's an interface paradigm that they're just not used to using. But at the same time, if you go back and watch that original iPhone demo that Steve Jobs did, and how many times did he slide to unlock that phone? And when you think about that today, if I had to slide to unlock my phone and type in a passcode today, I would throw the phone out. It would drive me crazy. And previous to that, of course, nobody had ever done that. So it took a while for people to get used to the idea of sliding to unlock your phone, and then using Touch ID to unlock your phone, and now using Face ID to unlock your phone. And as you get used to those interfaces, they become part of the, sort of the culture. And so I think as we get more and more used to this idea of devices that have facial data and accurate facial data, I think that you could do some interesting things with that, and in combination with eye tracking and stuff. The possibilities for that are just amazing. I'm really looking forward to seeing what people do with them.
Looking ahead even more beyond top notch, I think there is room as well for us to eventually see the device go completely edge to edge, because there is fringe technology out there already that would allow Apple to take everything that's in the sensor housing and distribute it throughout the display. So at MIT, I saw a few years ago that they have something called a bidirectional display. I think they were calling it BIDI displays for short. So your pixels are getting smaller and smaller. And what they've done is then take your camera sensors, which are also insanely small, and take all of the pixels, for lack of a better word, in the sensor, and taking that and spreading that out over the face of a screen. So interspersed between all the subpixels, you have sensors, light sensors, that all together work to serve as a camera sensor. And then let's say Apple does delve into doing light guide technology, they could have an infrared channel that would take care of this dot pattern that they're firing at your face right now to do the Face ID. So as these pixels get smaller, it will open up room for them to be able to include these other technologies potentially. And there are OLED versions of this out there already, very rudimentary form, where it's an OLED screen that is also acting as a camera. I've heard already that Apple's investigating micro LED technology, which would be their next step beyond OLED. They're already looking at shrinking down these pixels smaller and smaller. So I think in the not too distant future, we will eventually see the notch disappear. And it'll kind of be like the jump from CMOS based cameras to the CCD cameras that are now ubiquitous in laptops and mobile devices, and just about any digital camera today on that level is a CCD based camera, which we owe Apple a debt of gratitude for as well, because they're the ones who really spearheaded that, and were among the first to bring it to market, if not the first.
I don't think it's going to be too long before we start seeing some significant changes in the screen technology and the camera technology and the sensor technology. I don't think it's that far away. And again, as they bring it into larger number of devices, they can start to shrink it, and it's cost effective for them to shrink it. And then I think, it wouldn't surprise me if 10 years from now we're starting to look at replacing these pieces of glass that we carry around in our pocket with something that we wear as a pair of glasses or something like that, because I don't think that this form factor of having a big piece of glass in your pocket is much longer for this world. I think that you're going to be talking to your kids 20 years from now and saying, oh yeah, we used to carry around these big pieces of glass in our pocket and interacted with them, and I think that they're going to find that concept a little bit odd.
Yeah, the screens essentially become irrelevant once you can start beaming light right at your retina.
Yeah. And I know with some of one of the things that didn't really get a lot of airtime in the press recently was Apple's been working with some of the hearing aid technology to improve the Bluetooth support in them. And so there is a new generation of cochlear implants that has full Bluetooth low energy support in them. And so they can tie directly into your phone. Now you're getting all of the advantages of Bluetooth low energy in your cochlear implant. And you're now getting, in some cases, better audio service into your brain than people who don't have problems with their ears. I can see this being a technology that 10 or 15 years from now, people who don't have problems with their hearing at all are starting to look at this and saying, hey, why can't I get a cochlear implant that has full connectivity to my phone and be able to get all my music and podcasts and phone calls and everything directly into my ears without needing, AirPods or anything like that. So yeah, I think that's, I think the idea of the cyborg isn't that far away from a practical point of view, just because these technologies are all out there and they're starting to be produced in large enough numbers that it's cost effective to do it.
Google Glass uses bone conductivity, doesn't it?
I believe it did use bone conductivity, which isn't quite as good. So with a cochlear implant, you're actually tying into the hearing mechanism, yeah. And so there's certainly advantages to that. And I'll be honest, once that technology is good enough and it's a reliable surgery, I am going to be right there. I don't have a lot of problems with my hearing. I have some tinnitus, but otherwise my hearing is excellent. And I will be the first to stand in line and say, hey, let's wire this thing into my head so that I don't have to have earphones with me. It'd be nice to be able to walk down the road without needing headphones to be able to listen to things.
I wouldn't say I'd be the first in line, but I can certainly see it happening.
I might be number 10 in line, but maybe not number 1.
I'm quite satisfied with just having these little earbuds, which are effectively little old school hearing aids. They're really handy. I mean, it's really changed the way that I interact with my device over the last few years. And I've heard the same from a lot of people with AirPods once they were announced. I know it changed the way that a lot of people interacted with their devices after that.
Now, these small earbuds that you're using or earbuds that you're using, how much passive noise canceling do they do?
I would say none, because I'm only using it in a single ear, the way that I'm using it. So I'm still fully in tune with the world,
okay,
while also taking in auxiliary information. It's kind of like jacking into the Matrix and having something downloaded into my brain while I go about my daily life.
Okay. So I have a pair of AirPods that I do like a lot and I do use on a regular basis, but my biggest complaint about them is that they have no passive noise canceling, or almost effectively no passive noise canceling, which means that I can't use them in the shop because I have enough noisy things going on in the shop that if I want to listen to my AirPods, I'd have to crank the audio on them, which at that point you're then blasting sound into your ears at too high a volume. My biggest complaint about these kinds of things is the lack of passive noise canceling. And the advantage that I see in doing something like a cochlear implant is that I can then use, whatever hearing protection I want and block out the noises in the shop and then be able to still get good quality sound into my ears without needing to try and fit those things into, inside of ear defenders or something like that.
Is there something like Dre's studio headphones or Bose's Bluetooth headsets? Are those just too big and bulky for you to be able to use around the shop with their noise canceling?
We'll talk about that. I think we're going to do a gift guide or a shop guide thing at some point. And one of the things on my list is the Bose QC35s, the over-the-ear Bluetooth noise canceling headphones. And I do use those. I tend not to use the QC35s in the shop because they are relatively new and I don't want to destroy them. But I do have an older generation pair that I use. Now, my biggest complaint there is that they have a wire coming out of them, which frustrates me a lot and isn't always safe in the shop either. Having a wire dangling over a spinning lathe isn't a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely not.
But I do tend to use noise canceling headphones in the shop a lot, and that's how I've gotten around it. But my biggest complaint there is that most of them are either large, which again they're not uncomfortable. Like that's what I'm using right now are my QC35s while I'm recording this, and I find them comfortable. But if you're in the shop and it's hot and you're sweating, you don't necessarily want a full over-the-ear headphone on while you're doing that. So I do have a pair of earbud noise canceling headphones that I wear, but the problem with them is that they're wired. We're not quite there. We're getting there, but we're not quite there yet for people who do need to block out noise and whether you're on the bus or you're in a loud cafe or something like that, you do need some passive noise canceling.
Well, that serves as a nice teaser. Then perhaps we'll do a little gift guide for our next episode. Just things we find handy using around the shop.
I've got a nice list of things that I use on a daily basis that I can't live without. Next episode, maybe we'll talk about that a bit and some of the things that we need that are absolutely mandatory in our shop life.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.